The most dangerous betrayal is never the one you can see coming. It is the one spoken in a language you trust someone else to understand. Before anyone realized something was wrong, Ethan Romano believed he was about to close the most important international deal of his career. The agreement had taken nearly 18 months to negotiate. It involved a European technology consortium, multiple investment groups, and enough money to reshape entire markets. If everything went according to plan, the partnership would secure his company's future for decades. If it failed, competitors would move quickly to fill the gap. That morning, the top floor of Romano International buzzed with activity. Attorneys reviewed contracts. Analysts checked projections. Executives moved through glass hallways carrying tablets and reports. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline stretched across the city beneath a bright spring sky. Inside the main conference room, every chair had been filled. Representatives from overseas had arrived the night before. Financial advisors were prepared. Security personnel remained discreetly stationed outside the room. Everything appeared perfect. At the center of it all sat Ethan Romano. Calm, focused, confident. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with the precision expected from a man who spent his life negotiating billion-dollar decisions. For years, people had described him as a man who could read a room faster than anyone else. He noticed hesitation. He noticed confidence. He noticed weakness. Yet there was one area where he depended completely on another person. Language. Across the table sat Olivia Hart, his trusted translator. Olivia had worked beside Ethan for nearly 4 years. She accompanied him to international meetings, private negotiations, investment conferences, and diplomatic events. She spoke multiple languages fluently and had earned a reputation for exceptional professionalism. More importantly, Ethan trusted her completely. If Olivia said a foreign partner agreed to a term, Ethan believed her. If Olivia explained a concern, he accepted it. Nobody questioned her interpretations. Nobody had a reason to. Meanwhile, several floors below the executive offices, Grace Walker began her morning like every other day. She pushed a housekeeping cart through polished hallways, greeting reception staff and organizing conference areas before important meetings. Most executives barely noticed her. She preferred it that way. Grace had worked in the building for nearly 3 years. She was dependable, quiet, and observant. The kind of employee people often overlooked simply because they never expected her to know more than her job required. Few people knew that Grace spent evenings studying online courses. Even fewer knew she had grown up in a multilingual household. Her grandmother had immigrated from Puerto Rico decades earlier. As a child, Grace often listened to conversations switching naturally between English and Spanish around the dinner table. She never mentioned it because nobody ever asked. Shortly before noon, Grace entered the executive conference room carrying fresh coffee and bottled water. The meeting had already begun. Voices moved back and forth across the long table. Foreign representatives spoke. Olivia translated. Ethan listened carefully. Grace quietly placed coffee cups near each participant. Normally, she paid little attention to discussions. Business negotiations were not her concern. Then something unusual happened. One of the visiting executives spoke a short sentence in Spanish. Grace understood every word. The statement sounded simple enough. The executive expressed satisfaction with a specific partnership condition and emphasized the importance of maintaining equal decision-making authority between both companies. Grace continued pouring coffee while waiting for Olivia's translation. Instead, Olivia delivered something slightly different. Not completely different. Not enough to attract attention. Just different enough to change the meaning. Grace paused for a fraction of a second. Had she misunderstood? Perhaps she missed a word. Perhaps the conversation moved too quickly. She resumed working without reacting. A few minutes later, another exchange occurred. Again, Grace understood the original Spanish. Again, Olivia's translation shifted a small detail. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just a subtle adjustment. A phrase became softer. A concern became less important. A condition sounded more favorable than it actually was. Grace finished serving refreshments and slowly pushed her cart toward the door. As she left the room, she glanced back one final time. Ethan remained completely focused on the negotiation. Olivia continued translating with perfect confidence. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody appeared suspicious. Yet as the conference room door quietly closed behind her, Grace felt a strange uneasiness settle in her chest. Because sometimes betrayal does not arrive through obvious lies. Sometimes it arrives hidden inside a single sentence that nobody else understands. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince herself she had imagined it. The executive floor returned to its normal rhythm after the meeting ended. Foreign delegates left the conference room smiling. Attorneys carried folders back to their offices. Assistants coordinated schedules for the following day. Everything appeared successful. Everything appeared normal. Yet the uneasiness remained. As she organized supplies in a storage room later that evening, she replayed the conversation in her mind. The original Spanish had been clear. The visiting executive had emphasized equal authority between both parties. Olivia's translation, however, had softened that condition. Not removed it completely, just adjusted it enough to sound less significant. Grace leaned against a shelf and frowned. Perhaps it was a professional interpretation. Perhaps translators occasionally summarized ideas differently. She wanted to believe that explanation. It was simpler, safer. The next morning brought another round of negotiations. Representatives from Europe returned to Romano International for follow-up discussions. Once again, Grace found herself assigned to refresh the conference room throughout the day. Once again, she entered quietly with coffee, water, and trays of pastries while conversations unfolded around her. This time she paid closer attention. Not because she wanted to interfere, because she needed to know whether the previous day had been a misunderstanding. For nearly an hour, everything sounded normal. Olivia translated confidently. Ethan listened carefully. The visitors seemed satisfied. Then it happened again. A senior representative made a statement regarding financial oversight. Grace immediately recognized the meaning. He explained that both organizations expected shared transparency and equal access to project information. Olivia smiled politely and translated, but several important words disappeared. The translated version still sounded positive, still sounded cooperative, yet the balance of authority had subtly shifted. Grace felt her stomach tighten. This was no longer a coincidence. Later that afternoon, she found herself replaying the exchange repeatedly while cleaning a reception area. The more she thought about it, the more troubling it became. Neither alteration had been dramatic enough to attract suspicion. In fact, most people would never notice. The overall message remained similar. The meeting continued smoothly. No arguments occurred. No alarms sounded. Yet each adjustment quietly favored one side over the other. A few words here. A small omission there. Tiny changes capable of producing enormous consequences months later. By evening, Grace could no longer ignore her concern. During a break, she cautiously approached one of the mid-level managers she occasionally spoke with. He was reviewing reports near the employee lounge. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. The manager looked up. "Sure." Grace hesitated. Even now the idea sounded ridiculous. Do translators ever change the meaning of things during negotiations? The manager chuckled lightly. Not Olivia. Grace lowered her voice. What if somebody noticed something unusual? He smiled politely, assuming the question was harmless. Grace, Olivia is one of the most trusted people in the company. Ethan relies on her for everything international. What? Grace immediately regretted asking. No reason. The manager laughed and returned to his paperwork. Then do not worry about it. Grace nodded and walked away. But his reaction lingered. Not because he had been rude. Because he had never considered the possibility. Nobody had. Olivia's reputation protected her. Her position protected her. Her confidence protected her. As the sun disappeared beyond the city skyline, Grace finished her shift and headed toward the elevator. Through the glass wall of a nearby conference room, she spotted Ethan reviewing documents with Olivia standing beside him. They appeared completely comfortable, completely trusting. Ethan listened. Olivia spoke. Neither seemed aware that anything was wrong. Grace looked away and stepped into the elevator. She still had no proof, only questions. But deep down, she could no longer deny what her instincts were telling her. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, nobody else seemed able to see it. Over the next several days, Grace tried to focus on her work. She cleaned executive offices, prepared conference rooms, and organized supplies exactly as she always had. Yet every time she passed the international division, her attention drifted back to the same question. Why would Olivia keep altering those translations? The changes were small enough to escape notice, but they were too consistent to be accidental. Grace found herself listening more carefully whenever negotiations took place. She never lingered. She never interrupted. She simply observed. And the more she observed, the harder it became to dismiss what she was hearing. One afternoon, another meeting brought foreign investors into the building. Grace entered the conference room carrying fresh coffee. As she moved quietly between chairs, a representative from Madrid raised a concern regarding approval procedures for future project expansions. Grace understood the Spanish perfectly. The executive emphasized that all major decisions would require mutual agreement from both organizations. Olivia translated smoothly. Yet once again, the meaning shifted. The requirement for equal approval suddenly sounded more flexible, less restrictive, more favorable to one side. Grace nearly stopped walking. The pattern was undeniable now. She finished her task and left the room without revealing any reaction. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment reviewing everything she remembered. She opened a notebook and began writing. Date, meeting, original statement, translated version. At first, the pages contained only a few examples. Then more appeared. Small differences, repeated differences, consistent differences. Individually, none looked significant. Together, they formed something far more troubling. By the end of the week, Grace had filled several pages. Still, she lacked proof. Memory was not evidence. Suspicion was not evidence. She needed something stronger. The following morning, she encountered another obstacle. While organizing supplies near the executive lounge, she overheard several managers discussing Olivia. She saved that negotiation last month, one said. Another nodded. Ethan trusts her more than anyone. The conversation continued with praise for Olivia's professionalism, intelligence, and reliability. Grace remained silent. Every compliment made her task feel more impossible. Even if she approached someone with concerns, who would believe her? A translator with years of experience, or a maid carrying cleaning supplies? The answer seemed obvious. Yet something prevented her from giving up. Perhaps it was the certainty growing inside her. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable realization that Ethan Romano was making enormous decisions based entirely on information provided by one person. One evening, as she prepared a conference room after hours, she noticed a stack of translated meeting summaries left behind on the table. She did not touch them. She did not read confidential documents. But she noticed something else. Each summary listed Olivia as the sole translator responsible for communication between both sides. No secondary review. No independent verification. No backup. The entire process depended on trust. Grace stood quietly beside the empty conference table. Outside the windows, city lights stretched across the darkness. Inside the room, silence filled the space where critical decisions had been made all week. For the first time, a chilling possibility crossed her mind. What if the mistranslations were not mistakes? What if they were deliberate? Grace immediately pushed the thought away. It sounded too serious, too dangerous. Yet the question refused to disappear. She gathered her supplies and headed toward the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Olivia walking confidently through the executive corridor. Smiling, relaxed, completely certain nobody suspected anything. And somewhere deep inside, Grace realized she was no longer trying to determine whether something was wrong. She was trying to understand how long it had been happening. The question followed Grace everywhere. During her morning commute, during lunch breaks, during long evenings in her small apartment. How long had it been happening? The more examples she collected, the more impossible it became to ignore. Yet every new observation created another problem. She still had no proof strong enough to convince anyone. Only patterns. And patterns could be dismissed. 2 weeks passed. The international negotiations continued. New meetings filled the executive calendar almost daily. Each time foreign partners arrived, Olivia remained at Ethan's side. Each time Grace entered the conference room with coffee and refreshments, she listened carefully without drawing attention to herself. And each time she heard another subtle shift. A concern became a suggestion. A condition became a preference. A requirement became a recommendation. The original meaning never disappeared completely. It simply moved slightly, just enough to influence important decisions. One afternoon, Grace found herself reviewing her notebook during a break. She sat alone in a quiet corner of the employee cafeteria. Page after page contained examples. Different meetings, different participants, different topics, yet the same outcome. The adjustments consistently favored a particular foreign investment group that appeared repeatedly throughout the negotiations. Grace circled the company names several times. She had seen it before, not just in meetings, in reports left on conference tables, in presentation materials, in visitor schedules. The company seemed connected to nearly every major deal Olivia handled. That realization unsettled her more than anything else. Later that evening, she was assigned to prepare a private boardroom reserved for a small after-hours discussion. Most employees had already gone home. The executive floor felt unusually quiet. Grace arranged bottled water, notepads, and coffee service before leaving. As she stepped into the hallway, she realized she had forgotten a folder containing room inventory forms. She returned a few minutes later. The boardroom door was partially closed. Voices drifted into the corridor. Grace immediately recognized Olivia's voice. She stopped, not because she intended to listen, because one sentence caught her attention. Olivia was speaking Spanish. The conversation sounded casual at first. Then Grace heard the name of the investment group she had circled in her notebook. Her pulse quickened. She remained completely still. Olivia continued speaking. The discussion was brief. No direct admissions. No obvious criminal scheme. Yet something felt wrong. Extremely wrong. Olivia referred to upcoming negotiations and mentioned that everything was proceeding as expected. Then she laughed softly and said a phrase that froze Grace in place. They still trust every word. Silence followed. A few moments later, footsteps approached the door. Grace immediately pushed her cart forward and continued walking as though nothing had happened. Her heart pounded the entire way down the hallway. Back in the service area, she replayed the sentence repeatedly. They still trust every word. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps she was jumping to conclusions. Yet deep down, she knew the comment fit too perfectly with everything she had already observed. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table long after midnight. Her notebook lay open in front of her. Meeting notes covered several pages. Dates, names, translation discrepancies, patterns. For the first time, she drew a line connecting them all. When she finished, one conclusion remained. This was not carelessness. This was not professional judgment. This was not a misunderstanding. Someone was intentionally shaping information. And if Grace was right, Ethan Romano was making multi-million-dollar decisions based on words that were never entirely true. For the next several days, Grace stopped searching for suspicions and started searching for facts. She knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she approached Ethan Romano with nothing but observations, she would be dismissed immediately. Not because Ethan was unfair, because the accusation itself sounded impossible. Olivia had spent years building trust. Grace had spent years cleaning conference rooms. In a conflict between reputation and suspicion, reputation always won. So she remained silent. She continued her work exactly as before. She pushed her housekeeping cart through executive hallways. She prepared meeting rooms. She greeted employees with the same calm professionalism. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, everything changed. She began paying close attention to schedules posted outside conference rooms. She noted which foreign partners attended which meetings. She tracked the investment group, whose name appeared repeatedly throughout the negotiations. Every evening she returned home and added details to her notebook. Slowly, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The same company benefited every time important translation discrepancies occurred. The advantages were never dramatic. They were subtle. A voting condition adjusted here. A reporting requirement softened there. A financial responsibility reworded somewhere else. None of the changes attracted attention individually. Together, however, they consistently increased the influence of one particular organization. One afternoon, Grace experienced a breakthrough. A meeting involving representatives from Spain and Argentina ran longer than expected. By the time it ended, most executives rushed directly to another conference room. In the process, several printed agendas remained on the table. Grace entered afterward to clean. Normally, she ignored business documents completely. This time, however, she noticed something unusual. One agenda contained both English and Spanish summaries printed side by side. She did not remove the document. She did not photograph it. She simply read it while collecting empty coffee cups. Several sections matched the topics discussed earlier. More importantly, they matched the Spanish she had heard. Yet the translation Olivia provided. during the meeting had not matched the printed summary. Grace felt her pulse quicken. For the first time, she had something beyond memory, something beyond intuition, a documented difference. She carefully memorized the wording before continuing her work. That evening, she compared the printed summary to the translation she remembered hearing. The discrepancy was undeniable. The original text required shared approval authority. Olivia's translation described advisory consultation. The difference sounded small. In reality, it changed the entire balance of power. Grace stared at her notebook for several minutes. Then she noticed something else. The altered wording always benefited the same investment group. Not Ethan's company. Not the foreign partners. The same outside organization. Every time. The realization chilled her. This was no longer about mistranslations. This was about influence. The following day, another development deepened her concern. While delivering refreshments to a private executive lounge, Grace noticed Olivia seated alone reviewing documents on her laptop. The translator quickly minimized the screen the moment someone entered the room. Grace thought little of it until she caught a brief glimpse of a familiar logo before it disappeared. The investment group's logo. The same one she had circled repeatedly in her notebook. Olivia remained calm, professional, friendly. Yet for the first time, Grace felt certain she was looking at someone living two separate lives. One life existed inside Romano International. The trusted translator. The respected advisor. The indispensable expert. The other life remained hidden behind carefully chosen words. As Grace left the lounge carrying an empty tray, she understood something that made her uneasy. The evidence was beginning to point toward a deliberate betrayal. But evidence was not enough. She still needed proof strong enough to survive scrutiny. Because if she was wrong, she would lose everything. And if she was right, Ethan Romano was far closer to disaster than he realized. Grace knew she was running out of time. The negotiations were entering their final phase, and every day brought Ethan Romano closer to signing agreements that would shape the future of his company. If she waited too long, the damage might already be done. If she acted too soon, nobody would believe her. The balance between those two risks followed her everywhere. For several nights, she barely slept. Her notebook continued growing. Dates filled entire pages. Names appeared repeatedly. Translation discrepancies connected one meeting to another. Yet, even now, the evidence remained largely circumstantial. Strong enough to convince her. Not strong enough to convince Ethan. One rainy evening, while reviewing her notes at home, Grace noticed something she had overlooked before. The most significant translation changes always appeared during discussions involving final approval authority, financial oversight, or strategic control. In every case, the wording shifted power toward the same outside investment group. The pattern was too precise to be random. Grace stared at the pages spread across her kitchen table. Then an idea slowly formed. She did not need to prove every mistranslation. She only needed to prove one beyond dispute. One example clear enough that nobody could explain it away. The next opportunity arrived sooner than expected. A major negotiation was scheduled for the following week. Internal announcements described it as one of the final meetings before contract approval. Executives prepared presentations. Attorneys finalized language. Analysts reviewed forecasts. The atmosphere throughout Romano International became increasingly focused. Everyone understood the importance of the deal. Grace understood something else. If Olivia intended to manipulate another translation, it would likely happen during this meeting. Over the next several days, Grace paid closer attention than ever before. She memorized schedules. She noted which foreign representatives would attend. She reviewed every discrepancy recorded in her notebook. More importantly, she began preparing for a possibility she hoped would never happen. What if she needed to confront the truth directly? The thought terrified her. She was not an executive. She was not an attorney. She was not an investigator. She was a maid. A maid. Accusing one of the most trusted employees in the company. Every rational part of her mind warned her to walk away. Yet another voice kept returning. The voice that remembered Ethan sitting across negotiation tables believing every translated word. The voice that remembered years of trust being quietly exploited. One afternoon, while cleaning an executive conference room after a planning session, Grace found herself standing alone beside the enormous table where the final negotiation would soon take place. Outside the windows, storm clouds gathered above the city skyline. Inside, Dozens of prepared folders sat neatly arranged for the upcoming meeting. Grace looked at the empty chairs and felt the weight of what was coming. Somewhere within those future conversations, the truth would reveal itself. She could feel it. Later that evening, she encountered Olivia near the elevator lobby. The translator smiled warmly and exchanged a few polite words before continuing down the hallway. To everyone else, Olivia appeared exactly as she always had. Professional, confident, trusted. Grace watched her disappear around the corner. For a moment, doubt returned. What if she was wrong? What if months of observation had led her toward a false conclusion? Then she remembered the bilingual agenda, the altered translations, the private phone conversation, the repeated benefits flowing toward the same company. No, the pattern was real. As Grace stepped into the elevator, she made a decision. She would stop chasing suspicions. From this point forward, she would focus on obtaining undeniable proof. Because the final meeting was approaching, and deep down, she knew it might be her last chance to protect Ethan Romano from a betrayal he still could not see. The morning of the final negotiation arrived beneath dark gray skies and steady rain. From the moment employees entered Romano International, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations were shorter. Hallways moved faster. Every department understood the importance of the meeting scheduled for that afternoon. Months of negotiations had led to this moment. If everything proceeded as expected, Ethan Romano would sign agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars and establish one of the largest international partnerships in the company's history. By noon, the executive floor was operating with military precision. Attorneys reviewed final contracts. Analysts verified financial projections one last time. Foreign representatives arrived in black luxury vehicles and were escorted upstairs. Security personnel quietly monitored every entrance. At the center of everything stood the conference room where the final decision would be made. Grace arrived several hours early. She prepared water service, arranged refreshments, and checked every detail before the participants arrived. Outwardly, she appeared calm. Inside, her nerves felt stretched to their limit. For days she had been waiting for this meeting. For days she had been hoping an opportunity would present itself. Yet she still lacked the one thing she needed most. Proof so undeniable that nobody could dismiss it. As the room gradually filled, Grace moved quietly through her duties. Ethan sat at the head of the table reviewing documents. Olivia occupied her usual seat beside him. The foreign delegation settled across from them. Attorneys opened laptops. Advisors prepared notes. Everything looked exactly as it had during dozens of previous negotiations. Then the discussion began. The first hour passed without incident. Financial projections were reviewed. Timelines were discussed. Operational details were finalized. Grace remained nearby, serving coffee when necessary while carefully listening. Then the conversation shifted toward governance and long-term control of the joint venture. Immediately, her attention sharpened. A senior executive from Spain began speaking. His tone became more formal than before. Grace recognized every word. The executive clearly explained that final strategic authority would remain equally divided between all primary stakeholders and that no outside investment group would receive independent control over major future decisions. The statement could not have been clearer. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Across the table, Olivia nodded professionally and began translating. Then it happened. Olivia altered the meaning. Again, not slightly, not subtly. This time the difference was substantial. Her translation suggested that an advisory structure could allow expanded authority for certain investment partners under specific circumstances. Several executives immediately began taking notes. Ethan reviewed a document and nodded. The conversation moved forward. Grace stood frozen. This was it. The exact moment she had feared. The exact moment she had been trying to prove. Yet something else happened. The Spanish executive looked confused. Very briefly, very subtly. His expression changed for less than a second before the discussion continued. Most people never noticed. Grace did. The executive seemed surprised by the translation he had just heard. Suddenly, an idea formed. During a scheduled break 30 minutes later, the foreign delegates left the room for refreshments. Grace was assigned to replenish coffee service in an adjacent lounge area. As she entered, she overheard two Spanish representatives speaking quietly together. One of them mentioned confusion regarding a point discussed moments earlier. The other responded that perhaps something had been misunderstood. Grace's heart began racing. For the first time, the doubt was not hers alone. Someone else had noticed. Someone else had heard a discrepancy. As the representatives continued their conversation, Grace realized the opportunity she had been waiting for was finally here. The final meeting was exposing the truth all by itself. And somewhere inside that conference room, Olivia Hart still believed nobody could see what she was doing. The break lasted only 15 minutes, but for Grace it felt like the most important 15 minutes of her life. As the Spanish representatives continued their quiet conversation in the lounge, she focused carefully on every word. Their concern was obvious. One executive repeated the statement he had made regarding governance authority. The other immediately confirmed that the translation presented during the meeting did not fully match what had been said. Grace felt her heart pound. For weeks, she had been carrying suspicion. Now, for the first time, she had confirmation from someone directly involved in the negotiation. Yet she still faced the same problem. How could she bring the truth to Ethan without sounding unbelievable? When the delegates returned to the conference room, Grace remained behind for a moment. Her mind raced. Then she remembered something. Throughout the negotiation process, every major meeting had been professionally recorded for internal documentation and legal review. The recordings existed to protect all parties in the event of future disputes. Grace had seen the equipment herself. Cameras positioned near the ceiling. Audio systems built into the conference table. Suddenly, a path forward appeared. The meeting resumed. Discussions moved toward final approval. Attorneys prepared signature documents. Advisors reviewed the last remaining details. Across the room, Ethan appeared calm and confident. Olivia continued translating flawlessly, or so everyone believed. Grace knew she could not wait any longer. As soon as an opportunity presented itself, she quietly approached Ethan's executive assistant outside the conference room. The woman looked surprised. Grace rarely interrupted anyone. "I need to speak with Mr. Romano," Grace said carefully. "It is important." The assistant hesitated. "He is in the middle of the most important meeting of the year." Grace nodded. "I know. That is why it cannot wait." Something in her expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. The assistant studied her for a moment before disappearing into the conference room. A few minutes later, Ethan stepped into a private hallway. His expression showed mild confusion. Grace. This was the first time he had ever pulled her aside during business hours. Grace immediately felt the weight of what she was about to say. One wrong sentence could end her career. One wrong accusation could destroy her credibility forever. Yet she continued. "Sir, I believe there is a problem with the translations in the negotiations." Ethan stared at her. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his expression hardened slightly. Not with anger. With disbelief. "That is a serious statement." Grace nodded. "I know." Ethan folded his arms. "Why would you think that?" Grace carefully explained everything. The repeated discrepancies. The bilingual agenda. The patterns she documented. The concerns expressed by the Spanish representatives during the break. Most importantly, she did not ask him to trust her. She asked him to verify her claims himself. "Review the recordings," she said quietly. "Compare the original statements to the translations." Silence filled the hallway. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Part of him clearly wanted to dismiss the idea. Olivia had worked beside him for years. Grace was a maid. The situation made no sense. Yet something about Grace's calm certainty gave him pause. She was not emotional. She was not making accusations. She was asking for verification. Finally, Ethan turned toward his assistant. "Bring me the recording from today's session. Right now." 20 minutes later, a small group gathered in a private conference room. Ethan sat at the head of the table. Olivia sat nearby, visibly confused by the sudden interruption. Attorneys and senior advisors waited quietly. The recording began playing. The original Spanish statement filled the room. Then came Olivia's translation. The difference was immediate. Not dramatic enough for an outsider, but undeniable for anyone listening carefully. Ethan requested another section. Then another. Then another. Each comparison produced the same result. The room grew quieter with every recording. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And as the truth slowly revealed itself through Olivia's own words, the confidence she had carried for years began to disappear. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than any argument could have been. One recording became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 10. Each comparison revealed the same pattern. The original statements and the translated versions were close enough to appear harmless at first glance, yet different enough to influence major decisions. Attorneys reviewed transcripts. Advisors compared notes. The foreign representatives were invited into the room and confirmed what the recordings already showed. No raised voices filled the space. No dramatic confrontation erupted. The truth was doing all the work on its own. Ethan Romano sat motionless as the evidence unfolded in front of him. For years he had trusted Olivia completely. He trusted her words. He trusted her judgment. He trusted her interpretation of conversations he could not personally verify. Now he was forced to confront a reality he never imagined possible. The person he trusted most in international negotiations had quietly shaped information without his knowledge. Across the table, Olivia's confidence gradually disappeared. At first she attempted explanations. She described professional interpretation, cultural nuance, contextual adjustments. Yet every new recording weakened those arguments. The discrepancies followed the same direction too consistently. The same outside investment group benefited repeatedly. The same conditions shifted. The same authority structures changed. Eventually, the explanations stopped. Nobody needed to argue anymore. The facts were already sitting on the table. By late afternoon, the negotiations were paused pending a complete review. The foreign representatives expressed appreciation for the transparency. The attorneys began revising documents. Advisors reorganized schedules. What could have become a disastrous agreement had been stopped before signatures were placed on paper. Through it all, Grace remained almost invisible. She returned to her duties after speaking with Ethan. She cleaned conference rooms, organized supplies, completed the same responsibilities she performed every day. She did not wait outside executive offices for updates. She did not seek recognition. In many ways, she expected the entire matter to move forward without her. 2 days later, Ethan requested a meeting with senior executives, department leaders, and key staff members. The gathering took place inside the largest conference room in the building. Employees filled nearly every seat. Speculation spread quietly throughout the room. Most assumed the meeting concerned the negotiations. Few knew how much had happened behind closed doors. Ethan stood at the front beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The room gradually fell silent. He spoke briefly about the review process and the importance of accountability. Then he paused. His eyes moved through the crowd until they found someone standing near the back wall. Grace. Like always, she had chosen the least noticeable place in the room. "There is one person I need to thank," Ethan said. Confused faces turned throughout the conference room. Ethan continued. "A person who had every reason to stay silent. A person nobody expected to notice what others missed." Grace immediately looked down. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward her. Ethan walked away from the front of the room and stopped beside her. The gesture alone stunned everyone. This company avoided a mistake because someone had the courage to tell the truth when it would have been easier to say nothing. The room remained completely still. Grace Walker helped protect this company, this partnership, and every person sitting here. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then applause began. Slowly at first, then louder. Department heads stood. Managers stood. Executives stood. The entire room rose to its feet. Grace looked overwhelmed. Not because she wanted attention, because she never expected it. Ethan offered a small smile. It was not the smile of a powerful businessman addressing an employee. It was the smile of a man who finally understood who had been loyal all along. And as the applause echoed through the room, everyone saw something they had overlooked for years. The woman carrying coffee trays had carried the truth as well. And that day, the quietest voice in the building became the one nobody would ever ignore again.